The Unbroken had once been a noble vessel, a ship of the line. It had been built in the days when humanity was ascendant, and when the Great Crusade sought to once more cage the stars and bring enlightenment to the galaxy. The vessel had been used by some of the first Astartes when they deployed alongside the Solar Auxilia, and even after the Primarchs had been discovered, the ship held its course. It emptied its guns into enemy fleets, dropped entire battalions from orbit, and won its share of honors in wars whose names and stakes were forgotten by all but the ancient and the mad. The vessel had also been one of the countless ships commandeered by the War Master when he raised his banners of treachery and turned his forces against the Imperium. Though it had sustained damage on the push to Terra and was left scarred by the siege of humanity's homeworld, the Unbroken was one of thousands of ships that vanished into the warp. It had changed over the years. Its colors, once bright and proud, had charred and flaked away, revealing the blackened hull underneath. The steel of the bow scarred with the unblinking eye of the traitor and the eightfold path of chaos, both of them christened with blood and sacrifice. Most of the onboard lights had died long ago, and those that still functioned flickered like demon fire, filling the ship with shadows. The ship plowed the void like a wraith, its cannons glowing with banked hellfire as it sought to fulfill the singular purpose it was made for, the purpose that had twisted it into what it was now. Those who sailed upon this ship had not fared much better than the vessel itself. Where the elite of the Imperial Navy had once stood their posts on deck and called orders in clear, ringing tones, now twisted mockeries of the human form were chained in place, their lidless eyes staring into the black. The messages that came over the Vox growled in a cacophony of voices, speaking to the wretches that crewed the vessel in 1,000 different tongues. Whether the ship was possessed or its machine spirit had gone insane was impossible to tell, and in the end, it didn't matter. Not to the crew, nor to those they took prisoner. The black sails of the Unbroken's brig had never been welcoming places. Now they were mutated and terrible, stained by death and haunted by the screams of all the souls who had passed through them. Nightmares lived in the darkness of the vessel's guts, feeding off the remnants of what was left behind when the interrogations were finally finished. It was a place none dared go but the true masters of the ship, and they were rarely bothered to make that journey down into that prison unless there was something to be gained by doing so. Kai Sycodax had decided to grace the black cells with his presence. There was still a final prisoner left from the Warband's latest raid, and he wished to offer a final chance to take communion. The Black Legionnaire walked through the brig, corpse lamps on the walls sparking into ghoulish life at his approach. Tall and regal, the pallid light dancing off the gold highlights of his warplate as he strode down the corridor. Horns rose gracefully from his helm, and his eye lenses burned with a steady red light. A cape hung from his shoulders, the edges always dancing just above the corruption that lined the grates. A long, elegant blade hung from his hip, and a bolt pistol even older than his armor rested in a cross drawer with its butt forward. He was unbowed and unhurried, an archfiend walking through his personal corner of hell. And just to complete the picture, he was attended by two of the Tormentors, the elite warriors who followed at the Warband's heels like well-trained hunting hounds. They held their weapons at the ready, their lean faces unmoving, and their dark eyes hungry as they swept the darkness, searching for any threat bold or hungry enough to turn on them. The fallen Astartes raised his sigil from where it hung on his chest, and the auto guns that watched the hallway outside the only occupied cell deactivated. The locks to the heavy steel door turned, and the door itself opened at his approach. Bright lights snapped on inside, glaring down at the room's only occupant. Kai gestured with a hand, and the two scarred warriors took up position to either side of the door. The Black Legionnaire entered and closed the door at his back. The captive sat in the center of his cell. He was naked, with manacles at his wrists binding him to the floor. Dirt and blood streaked his arms and chest, but his face was unmarred by scars or wounds. Though his body was corded with rippling muscle, the halo of blonde hair that framed his face made him seem almost boyish. His eyes were hot, and though tears trembled on his lashes, they did nothing to dull the wrath that burned in his gaze. Kai smiled beneath his helm. It had been many years indeed since he had laid eyes on a cousin of the blood. But there was no mistaking a son of the great angel Sanguinius. The prisoner rose to his knees, straining at his bonds, baring his sharp teeth in a snarl.
"Peace, cousin. Peace,"
Kai said, raising his empty sword hand and holding it palm outwards in a placating gesture.
"Let us talk, you and I."
"Talk of what?"
the prisoner demanded, spitting the words as if they were venom.
"Of my brother's screams, of my captain's oaths, or shall we speak of the deafening silence that fills this prison now that both of those things are absent?"
"We may speak of such things, should you wish,"
Kai said. He raised his hand, disconnecting his helm. He lifted it from his head and tucked it beneath his arm. A shock of black hair fell across his tanned forehead, and he looked at his cousin with eyes that were dark pools. He smiled, showing strong, straight teeth. He let this son of the angels see that beneath this ancient armor and its sigils of chaos, his flesh was as perfectly wrought as it had ever been. Kai stepped closer and lowered himself to one knee, ensuring he and the prisoner were nearly at eye level.
"I will tell you no lies, cousin. We are above such things, you and I. All I ask in return is your name."
For a moment, Kai was certain the Marine was going to do something rash, activate his Betcher's gland and try to kill him, perhaps. Perhaps he would lash out and try a kick, hoping he could move quickly enough to cave in Kai's unprotected skull. He watched the war of emotions on the younger Astarte's face with great interest. After a second that seemed to stretch on for a small eternity, the younger Marine withdrew into himself. He sat on his heels and unclenched his fists. The tension went out of his arms and shoulders, and the cords in his neck relaxed. His face was serene, but for that hot, wet gaze. It was the one thing he could not control.
"My name is Aston Furon,"
he said, speaking clearly, even if he bit off the end of each word. Kai inclined his head. He noted the lack of rank or honorifics, but did not remark upon the absence. He had seen the Marine's armor and recognized his chapter badge. It did not surprise Kai that his cousin would have only his name to offer.
"You may call me Kai Sycodex,"
Kai said.
"I doubt the name means any more to you than your name means to me. But to prove my good faith, ask me what you wish to know, and I shall tell you."
"What befell my brothers?"
Aston asked. Kai pressed his thumb against a hard-top container on his belt. There was a sharp click and a whirring noise as the assist mechanism pressed the contents into his hand. Rather than a magazine of ammunition, though, Kai held up a flat, rectangular case. It had been painted yellow, with a checkered black and white field on the lid. A bleeding heart sat atop that field, rendered in a perfect hand. The box was dented and scarred, carrying the marks of long travel and hard use. The young Marine said nothing, but the sight of the box stole the wind from him as surely as any blow.
"They died well, if it's a consolation to you,"
Kai said as he opened the small case. Inside was a stack of heavy cards, the edges slightly bent from long use. Kai turned the case over, sliding the cards into his hand.
"There was no begging, no bargaining. None of them accepted my offer to bend the knee and swear to the War Master."
"Did you expect them to?"
the young Marine asked, his voice a sharp hiss.
"I did not. I have seen many sons of Sanguinius in my time. You are all as dangerous as you are strong-willed.
Kai smiled ruefully as he held up the deck.
And while I have seen many librarians over the years, never did I see one who carried a deck like this. I take it you recognize these well enough.
Those cards belong to Captain Gary and Aleo,
Astin said. His throat clenched and his voice hitched, but he shook his head hard. Not in denial, but as if he were trying to throw off the grip of grief before it could fasten around his throat.
He wouldn't even tell us his name,
Kai said. In a display of dexterity and grace, he carefully rearranged the cards in his palm. His dark eyes never left the bound Marine as he shuffled, and Astin's eyes focused on the cards with a singular ferocity that was almost unnerving.
Shall I lay out your future for you, to allow the warp to convince you where my words might fail?
Astin said nothing. Kai shuffled for another few moments, then he began to draw and to lay the cards out one by one. He placed them in a pattern he called the Broken Wheel, laying the cards along the eightfold path in an alternating pattern. It was as if the symbol of chaos were being woven, the lines of fate teased out, and then revealed with every turn of the deck.
Here is the start of your journey, the Squire. I suppose this is your captain's interpretation of the young warrior, as the sword and training yard in the background are much the same. Then we come to the next step, the Astartes. I can imagine the relief you felt when the process was done, and the pride that blossomed in your chest when you were given your armor. While we may not say it aloud, even among each other, there was a part of us all who feared we would fail that final test.
The young Marine held his silence. If not for the pulse in his neck, he might have been a statue. Kai turned the next card and looked at it a moment before he laid it down.
The Warped Renegade,
he said with a small laugh.
An unflattering portrait, but not an inaccurate one if I'm forced to be honest. Then again, it is just as possible this is meant to be another member of the ship's warband, eh?
Astin didn't speak, but Kai nodded, just as if the younger Marine had agreed with him. He drew the next card and pursed his lips while he stared at it.
The sword,
he said, laying it at the position of the western spoke of the wheel.
This card could be a metaphor. See, here, the rays of golden light that shine from the blade. It is not unlike the color of your armor. But if we look more closely here, do you not think this sword bears a striking resemblance to the one your captain wielded? From one bladesman to another, it was a thing of beauty, and a privilege to carry it, even for a brief time. I took it to the armory myself, and ensured it was properly locked in place.
Its name is Thankyou,
Astin said, speaking almost as if he was in a dream or a trance.
It means the thirst.
A fearsome name for a fearsome blade,
Kai said, drawing the next card.
Perhaps it was merely an artistic decision to place an image of that sword here, in this deck. But we should not dismiss what the cards show us as mere coincidence, should we, cousin?
Kai turned the card and chuckled to himself. It depicted a swirling miasma of greens and reds that seemed to nearly pulse on the card. It was a thing of darkness that seemed to suck at the space around it, drawing the eye just as it drew light from the surrounding stars. Kai placed the card into the arrangement and then tapped it with the tip of his armored finger.
The eye. A simple enough statement to follow. Have you ever seen it, cousin?
No,
Astin said. A tremble went through his body as he spoke, a shiver that made Kai think of a fever. He watched Astin for a long moment before his smile returned to his face. It did not reach his eyes, though.
Perhaps you may yet have the honor of doing so,
the Black Legionnaire said. Kai pulled the next card and frowned at it. It was a detailed portrait worthy of a master, with all the horror of a nightmare made flesh. A colossal figure melded with impossible armor, his dimensions fearsome and terrible, his eyes burning with the colors of the ancient gods. He held out a bloody claw, as if beckoning the viewer to come and face him, if they had the mettle to do so. It was the War Master Abaddon, but the card was inverted. Kai considered writing it, but he had said there would be no lies between them. Not only that, but breaking the pattern with a lie just before the final card could have consequences he would rather avoid.
The War Master,
Kai said, the corners of his mouth turning down slightly.
A good likeness. It does not capture the details of his form, but I would say that his soul is on full display in this portrait.
It's upside down,
Aston remarked.
All the better for you to see it,
Kai said. He was tiring of the game, and he pulled the last card of the spread. His frown deepened. A winged figure knelt in a pool of its own blood, a spear stuck into the ground nearby. Its teeth were gritted, and every throbbing vein and line of muscle seemed to strain as it tried to lift itself up against impossible odds. Shadows surrounded the figure, their weapons raised, and their mouths open in silent war cries. He had never seen such a card in any deck of the Emperor's Tarot before. He placed it in the final, empty spot and spoke the name of the card as if ending a ritual.
The Martyr.
Another shiver went through the young Marine as the telling finished. He stared at the cards, his eyes empty and unseeing. He looked as if he'd been struck. The tears that had been welling in his eyes spilled over, cutting clear rivulets down his cheeks, and leaping from his long lashes as he tried to blink them away. He bowed his head, a gesture filled with both supplication and shame. The muscles of his back and shoulders bunched, flexing, as if he were going to be sick. A sob tore through him, ripping out from deep in his guts. Wet spatters fell on the cards as Aston made a guttural sound deep in his throat. It was the sound of a wounded animal in pain. A wide smile twisted Kai's lips, baring his teeth in a predatory grin.
Dry your tears, cousin,
Kai said. He reached out a hand and rested it on the young Marine's shoulder.
There is no need for you to weep.
Kai's eyes fell to the wheel of chaos he had deftly laid out. He blinked. Spatters of blood dotted the cards, each drop so thick and dark it could only be the blood of an Astartes. The racking sobs that had filled Aston's chest had grown deeper, his breath tearing in and out of his throat like a panting wolf. Kai wondered if the young Marine had ruptured something, or if he'd bitten off his tongue. Before he could move, Aston raised his head and met Kai's gaze. His eyes were nearly black, the pupils so wide that they drowned the light in their depths. Blood ran from his eyes like crimson tears, dripping from the tip of his nose. His lips quivered, showing his long, sharp teeth. Lightning shot through Kai's mind, ignited by the immediate danger in front of him. His gene-forged body was already emptying adrenaline into his bloodstream, and combat stim shot into his widening veins, traveling with every beat of his twin hearts. His nerves twitched, electrical signals crackling through the black carapace as he commanded his power armor to move. Time slowed down, and seconds stretched out into liquid eternities. But Aston moved even faster. In the time it took for the first impulse to light in Kai's mind, the young Marine's muscles surged forward. His restraints, which had been strong enough to hold him for days, snapped under the force of his fury. The steel dug furrows into his wrists and flayed flaps of skin from the back of his hands, dislocating several of his fingers, but Aston didn't seem to notice. Kai's legs were flexing, and he tried to raise one arm to shield himself, but it was like he was moving underwater as the younger Marine shot through the gap in his defenses. One bloody hand clamped onto the side of Kai's head, yanking it to the side hard enough he felt something in his spine give way with a brittle snap. Then there was a sharp, wet heat at his throat, just above his gorget. Aston's fangs sank deep into Kai's flesh, and he yanked his head like a hunting beast. Blood fountained from torn arteries, and air whistled through the Black Legionnaire's rent windpipe. He reached for Astin's head, but Kai's armored fist only caught hold of the Marine's blonde locks. Lunging forward once more, Astin sank his own wounded fingers into Kai's throat and ripped the hole wider, burying his face in the wound as he bit, tore, and drank. Kai's body shuddered beneath him and went still as Astin raised his dripping maw from the nearly decapitated corpse.
These tears are not for me,
Astin growled as he placed his hands on either side of Kai's head, staring into the dead man's eyes as he started to squeeze.
They're for you and all the other traitors!
Tyrion frowned, staring down at the deck near his feet. A round drop of nearly black liquid sat, surrounded by a halo of pure, clean steel. He glanced ahead and saw another a few feet away, then another, and another. Glancing back over his shoulder, he took a knee and frowned.
What the hell are you doing?
Farnham growled over his shoulder. The heavy stubber in the sergeant's hands was steady as he covered the hallway in front of them, and he sniffed through his crooked nose.
I found something,
Tyrion said, dipping the pad of his index finger in the spot. It was warm and slick.
Don't touch it,
Vars hissed, the red lenses of his false eye pulsing in the dark, like a cinder debating if it wanted to burst back into flame.
Spectrum,
Farnham said, turning his bald head to look at his second in command. Vars took a hand off his plasma gun and touched the small panel on the side of his bionic as he peered down at Tyrion's hand.
It's biological,
he muttered, his unaltered eye narrowing as his prosthetic one clicked and whirred.
Spectrometer readings are off. None of these numbers make sense.
Tyrion carefully brought his hand towards his face and sniffed. The sharp stench of copper crawled up his nose, powerful enough to make his eyes water.
It smells like blood.
Vars leaned closer, his scarred lip drawing back from his yellowed teeth. Then he stretched his neck until it cracked with a hollow crunch.
I don't know what kind of thing could survive having that in its veins.
Conversation for another time,
Farnham said, the burn scars along one half of his head tightening up as he frowned.
We're here for a reason. Focus! Urlock wants a report on what's happening, and if we don't get it to him prompt-like, we better hope it's because we're dead.
Each of them took a fresh grip on their weapons, and a deep breath of the foul, stagnant air. Farnham lifted 2 fingers and a thumb before curling his hands into a fist, then pointing down the hall. They split into an advanced pattern, with Farnham in the lead, and the other 2 flanking him in a staggered line on either end of the hall. Their boots splashed through muck, and their body armor creaked. Sweat trickled down their necks and stung their eyes, but none of them was willing to blink. Down here, a moment's lost concentration would be what turned you into meat, and their deaths would be ignored by all except those it mildly inconvenienced. Vars hissed, the noise quiet enough that it didn't carry far beyond Farnham's position. The sergeant glanced over his shoulder. Vars drew his thumb across his throat, held up 2 fingers and pointed into the darkness ahead. Farnham nodded and advanced. Tyrion swallowed and did the same. As the caged lights flickered into life, they illuminated a scene of carnage. Fresh blood dripped from the walls and puddled on the floor. Viscera was spread in a grotesque pattern, and severed limbs lay a dozen yards or more from where their owners had fallen. Above them was a hollow, sparking socket in the wall. The auto guns had been torn out of their mounting and reduced to little more than a pile of scrap. It wasn't the worst thing any of them had seen since taking service with the warband, but it was enough that all 3 of them toggled their weapons fire switches up a notch. Farnham pointed at the door of the cell that hung ajar, held up his fingers, and counted down. When he made a fist, they hit the door hard, sweeping their guns as they looked for a target. All they found were 2 bloody broken chains and a dead Astartes. The 3 of them stood there for a long moment, frozen as they regarded the figure sprawled out on the floor. Kai Sikadax, the voice of the Iron Brotherhood, was unrecognizable but for his armor. His throat had been rent open, and his head crushed like it had been put in a hydraulic press. The skull had been peeled open like a boiled egg, the scalp tossed aside like a discarded wrapper. As they stood there, they felt the ship shudder, yawning to one side hard enough to send them stumbling for a moment.
The hell was that?
Vars growled.
How should I know?
Farnham snarled back.
Where's his brain?
Tyrion asked. The sergeant and his second snapped back to the moment. Tyrion could tell neither of them liked the question he'd asked, and they liked even less that they didn't have an answer to it. Farnham crouched down, lifting the Space Marine's pulped head to look beneath it. The sergeant grunted and wiped his hands on his pants.
It's not here. That's for damn sure.
Off in the distance they heard gunfire. It was muted by distance and intervening bulkheads, but there was no mistaking that harsh chattering for anything other than what it was. A louder sound eclipsed the discharge, and when it faded, all they heard was silence. The three troopers looked at one another before returning their gazes back to the Astartes corpse.
If it's not here, where the hell could it be?
Tyrion asked. His voice was high, and he felt like he was having trouble getting his breath. Farnham clapped him on the side of his helmet hard enough to get Tyrion's attention, then turned him around by his shoulder straps before taking the handset off the Vox unit on Tyrion's back. As he dialed in the connection, Farnham barked orders over his shoulder to Vars, once again in control of himself and the situation.
See if you can figure out who was watching the door,
he said, rattling through the frequencies. Vars stepped back out the door just as Farnham started speaking into the handset.
Vultures calling the roost. Do you read us, Roost?
Report, blast you.
A voice that sounded like an engine trying to shake itself apart demanded over the blaring of alarms in the background. A shiver went through Tyrion. Even over the crackling line, he recognized the voice of Erloc Numastar. The former Iron Hand was usually as even-toned as the machinery he tended, and Tyrion had never once heard him like this. Neither had Farnham, judging from the snap he put in his voice.
Sir, contact made in the brig,
he shouted, ensuring he could be heard over the transponder.
3 casualties. The prisoner escaped.
There was no response. If not for the alarms transmitting over the line, Tyrion would have thought it had gone dead. Yet another victim to the vagaries of technology within such an old, warp-riddled ship. When Erloc spoke again, his voice was lower, his words the growl of grinding gears.
Sycodax is dead.
Yes, sir,
Farnham replied.
The prisoner tore out his throat.
Anything else?
Erloc demanded.
Are Kai's weapons missing? His power armor?
Farnham frowned, surveying the body.
His blade and bolt pistol are gone. His armor's still here.
Anything else?
Erloc asked.
His brain, sir,
Farnham said, swallowing.
It's gone.
The silence stretched out longer this time. So long that, for a moment, Tyrion thought the line had been left open. Then Erloc spoke again, his voice absent any kind of emotion.
Converge on the armory immediately,
the Forge Master said.
Gather any forces you find on your way, under my authority. If you come across the prisoner, you shoot to kill. Assume nothing. If he's eaten Sycodax's brain, then the Lamenter knows everything about this ship and its crew that Kai did. We need to put him down quickly, before this blasted warp storm gets any.
The Voxling terminated with a squeal of static. Tyrion looked back at his sergeant, a question in his eyes. Before he could say a word, the ship pitched again, the light sputtering into darkness. Tyrion's helmet clanged off the deck, and he spun through a blackness filled with vertigo. The ship righted itself violently, and Farnham's weapon discharged as he fell. Bullets ricocheted through the room, sparking off the steel walls like comets. One of them tore through Tyrion's shoulder, and the sharp, immediate pain was enough to blow the mist out of his brain. He cried out, clutching at his wound. As he did, Tyrion felt a heat blooming in his skin. The heat expanded, burning through his veins, making his muscles spasm and flex. His ears grew sharper, his skin more sensitive, and his nose more keen. He could feel the pressure of the atmosphere against his body, and hear the blood roaring through his veins. But the only thing Tyrion could smell was blood. A bright, blue-white light pierced the darkness as Vars stood in the open hatch. his plasma gun clutched in both hands. His bionic eye swept the room, and his lips curled back from his teeth.
What the hell is happening?
Vars demanded.
I don't know,
Farnham said, getting to his feet. He dug in his belt pouch until he found his angled flash, securing it in a strap on his armor before flicking it on. He knelt near Tyrion and helped roll him onto his side.
Urlock said get to the armory, so that's what we're gonna do. Did you find out who was out there? Bragg and Hart,
Vars said.
Checked their clips. They didn't even get off a shot. That's comforting,
Farnham growled.
I think you shot me,
Tyrion said, pursing his lips and frowning.
Sharp as ever. Move your hand,
Farnham said, pulling Tyrion's hand away before he could comply with the order. Tyrion saw that the tip of his first finger was coated with his own blood now, from where he'd accidentally pressed the digit into his wound.
Extend your arm.
Tyrion did as he was told. There was pain there, but it was far away. He swore he could feel his body trying to put itself together again, his heart beating hard and fast in his chest. His nose was numb, and no matter how bright the light, his pupils wouldn't constrict. Farnham nodded, drew his knife, and cut away Tyrion's sleeve so he could get to the wound. Once the injury was unobstructed, the scarred sergeant took out a pressure patch and ripped it open. He pressed the two sides on simultaneously, the chem seal hissing as it affixed itself to Tyrion's wound and went to work.
You're lucky,
Farnham said, offering Tyrion his hand.
Through and through. No major bleeders, cuts, or bones broken. On your feet now, before something down here gets the smell of fresh blood and comes to see what's what.
Tyrion bared his teeth and grabbed Farnham's hand with his uninjured arm. The sergeant hauled Tyrion to his feet, then slid his heavy stubber back into his hands. Tyrion stepped to where his las had fallen, picked it up, and checked it. It had a few new dents and dings, but the power pack was solid, and it hummed when he flicked the safety off. Farnham nodded, clapped Vars on the shoulder, and the three of them moved. They ran, boot heels banging on the steel grating, splashing through puddles of unidentified ichor and stagnant water. Vars called distances and trajectories, scanning the darkness beyond the reach of their meager lights. They all kept their weapons up, each covering a different direction. They bolted down side corridors, weaving and changing direction to throw off the scent of anything that might hear them down there. All they saw was darkness, though, and all they heard was the panting of their own breath and the pounding of their blood in their ears. Their nerves were stretched taut as steel cables, ready for anything to happen. But nothing did.
Wait,
Vars rasped, putting up a hand to stop them as he stared around a corner. They'd pelted down a side corridor, cutting toward one of the three stairwells that led out of the brig and which gave them easy access to deck lifts. Farnham half collapsed against the wall, chest rapidly expanding and deflating as he sucked in air. Tyrion was panting, his mouth open like a dog, but he didn't feel winded. If anything, he felt like he could run from where they were all the way back to the armory if he had to. Vars leaned out a little further, and his mouth dropped open slightly as his bionic whirred and clicked, peering into the dimness. When he next spoke, his words were tinged with something Tyrion had never heard come out of the man's throat, a mixture of awe and fear.
Liar's throne. What are you staring at?
Farnham snarled. He shoved past Vars, advancing down the hallway. Tyrion followed on his heels, covering their rear. Farnham's footsteps stuttered, then stopped. When Tyrion turned around, he saw what had rooted Vars to the spot. The stairway out of the brig was a twisting spiral cage, meant to provide maximum cover to those who were defending it from anything that might try to force its way up from below. Gun ports along the side had discouraged most things from trying, and aside from occasional incursions by the slithering monstrous things that lived in the ship's guts, these stairs were the safest place one could be on this level. It still hadn't been enough. A river of gore led to the stairs, and ichor splattered the walls. A carpet of corpses covered the floor, the bodies so badly mutilated it was impossible to tell where one ended and another began. There were heads barely recognizable as human, pale, putrescent limbs with too many hands and too many fingers. as well as torsos covered in sores, extra eyes, and worse. The armor plating of the stairs had been ripped apart, the metal reduced to slag by the field of a power weapon, and then rent asunder and flung to the floor. Bodies hung from the armored overhang above, a mute testament to the savagery at the being who had torn through this hard point like an angry storm, leaving nothing but silence and blood in its wake.
Looks like we found where the prisoner went,
Farnham said. He spoke louder than normal, but it wasn't enough to cover up the brittle core of his voice.
Come on, boys. We don't want to let him get away, do we?
Tyrion and Vars said nothing, but they followed Farnham through the bodies and up the stairs to the staging area. They found more of the same, with the security personnel cut to ribbons. Judging from the scorch marks and shrapnel, someone had managed to get a grenade off in the small space. It had done more damage to the defenders than their target, it seemed. The consoles were smashed, their screens reduced to splinters, but red lights still flashed in a few places. 3 open lifts stood arrayed against the rear wall. One of them was gone.
Should we call this in?
Tyrion asked.
No point,
Farnham said, clambering into one of the lifts. When the others had joined him, he hit the button for the deck they wanted.
Urlock doesn't care where the prisoner ain't. He said get to the armory, so we get to the armory.
The 3 of them said nothing as they rose up into the middle decks of the ship. In the silence, though, they heard the blaring alarms and the sound of distant weapon discharges. The lift shuddered, halting while it was halfway between decks. The ship groaned, and a light blew in its cage above them.
Vars, boost me up,
Farnham growled, pushing his weapon up onto the deck.
Tyrion, cover me.
Vars cupped his hands and Farnham planted his boot in the stirrup. Vars grunted, and Farnham hauled himself up, scraping his armor on the deck plating. The sergeant was on his feet in a moment, weapon in hand as he scanned the hall. Vars jerked his head, and Tyrion went next. He practically launched himself from Vars' hands, wriggling through the gap quickly. Blood stained the patch on his shoulder, but the wound felt numb. His boots were barely clear when the lift shuddered, dropping several inches.
This damn thing is gonna shake itself apart,
Farnham snarled. He slung his weapon, then held out his hand.
Jump, damn you!
Vars leaped, grabbing the edge of the deck, and Farnham's hand. The sergeant grunted, and the lift shuddered again, the cage slamming back and forth in its steel throat. Tyrion grabbed Vars by the arm, hauling hard enough to whip Vars up through the gap. Not 2 seconds after his boots were clear, there was a snapping sound, and the lift plummeted. The 3 of them stared down at the empty hole, breathing hard, when a fireball exploded down at the base of the shaft.
My gun was still on the deck,
Vars said once the explosion burned itself out.
Just grab another one,
Farnham said, gesturing down the corridor.
It looks like you can have your pick.
Tyrion glanced down the corridor and saw the sergeant was right. It looked like there had been a double stack of shooters ready to greet the escaped prisoner. The walls and deck were scored and burned from las rounds, and there were patches of slag from plasma discharge. There was also more blood, and too much of it to tell whether or not the team had hit what they were aiming at. What they could clearly see, though, were huge red footprints on the other side of the massacre, and an empty bolt pistol left on the deck. And though the footprints faded a dozen yards past the butchery, Tyrion spied something else. Fat, round droplets. And now that they were in a corridor with proper lighting, he could see that they weren't black. They were just a red so dark it looked black at first glance.
What are you staring at?
Farnham grunted.
Nothing,
Tyrion said, wiping his nose before putting his rifle back to his shoulder.
Nothing at all.
Farnham eyed him a moment longer, then turned away, waving them on. They picked their way through the mess, stopping only long enough for Vars to snatch up a hotshot las rifle, checking the power pack and ensuring it was still in working order. Properly armed once more, they set off at a trot. At every intersection they prepared to come face to face with the target, but all they found was brutality and blood. Body after body had been ripped and torn until the sight no longer had an impact. These weren't comrades in arms. They weren't shipmates. They weren't even people. They were just meat that had gone into a grinder and been chewed to pieces. Farnham didn't even glance down as he stamped through their spilled guts. Vars did the same, letting his bionic tell him where his attention was most needed. Tyrion didn't look at what he was stepping over, but the reek of congealing blood filled his nostrils, and the wet, sloshing sounds of his steps were loud in his ears. And though he lost the trail time and time again, he always found it once more. Those dripping, bloody tears that led him ever onward. The armory had been one of the most secure locations on the Unbroken, with layers of security enclosing it in an envelope of protection. The sentry stations watching it were dead, the gun emplacements smouldering wrecks of slag melted by overheated discharge. Most of the lumens were dead in their cages, and the few remaining lamps flickered over a dozen more bodies. The security gate was bent and broken, and the access doors beyond hung half open. The huge steel slabs of the armory door were trying to close, but something was malfunctioning, and they only managed to close halfway before opening again. The whining hydraulics were the only thing they could hear. Farnham waved them into an alcove, handing his weapon off to Vaz to cover the corridor. Turning Tyrion around, Farnham plucked up the handset of the Vox unit.
Vultures calling Forge Master,
Farnham said.
We are in position. Do you read, Forge Master?
There was no reply but silence and static. Farnham repeated the hail once more, getting the same response. He hung up the handset, grunting as he took his weapon back from Vaz.
All right, we rush on 3,
Farnham said, his tongue darting over his lips.
Have you lost it?
Vaz hissed between his teeth.
After everything we've seen, you want to go in guns blazing? Right now, our best case scenario is the prisoner has moved on, and there's nobody in there. Once we clear the room, we can trade up for something with real stopping power and hold the armory,
Farnham said. What is the worst case scenario? Tyrion asked. He wasn't looking at Farnham. He was looking at the corridor beyond their alcove. He counted a dozen of the deep red tears going towards the armory.
If we're really unlucky,
Farnham said, checking the chamber on his shooter and thumbing a hanging bead of sweat from the tip of his nose.
The bastard's still in there and ready to add us to the butcher's bill. And if that's the case, I'd rather have him in a metal box with nowhere to hide than out here in the corridor with us, wouldn't you?
Farnham didn't wait for an answer. He touched Vaz, then Tyrion, telling them which order the stack would go in. He peered around the edge of the corridor, then held up 3 fingers as he timed the hydraulic chewing of the entry doors. When he'd counted down to a fist, he rushed forward. Dutifully as ever, the others followed, weapons up and their fingers on their triggers. They slipped through the door one after the other, Farnham going to the left and Vaz to the right, each sweeping their side of the room. Adrenaline pumped through Tyrion's veins as he stepped over the threshold, and time seemed to slow. In the space between one beat of his heart and another, he saw everything. The armory had been a place of order in the decrepit chaos of the Unbroken. Racks of weapons had stood as straight as parade ground battle lines, each with ammunition magazines held in a spring-loaded clip for maximum efficiency. The walls had been lined with tools and machinery in neat, orderly rows, each serving its specific purpose in the assembly line of war. Terrible suits of power armor had stood guard near arming stations, seeming to glower at the room as they bided their time to stride into battle once more. The regimented, machine-like order had felt almost holy, anointed with oil and scoured clean with a ritual regularity. And if this place had been a temple, then Urlok Numastar, an Astartes who had become more metal than flesh over the journey that had brought him into the open arms of the Black Legion, had been its priest. Both the priest and his sanctuary had been defiled. The once pristine order of the place had been cast down. The racks had been tipped over to spill their contents across the floor or blown to pieces by weapons discharge. Steel ran in molten patches from the impacts of plasma rounds, and the war plate had been cast down and scattered. At the far end of the armory, before the massive growling forge, lay the master of this place. Urlok lay on his back, a puddle of mingled oil and blood spurting and leaking from dozens of different wounds. A broken power sword was rammed through his visor, nailing his corpse to the grating. Energy sparked from the dying weapon, making the corpse twitch spasmodically, as if the figure in black armor was still trying to rise to continue the battle. The creature that stood above the fallen Astartes was a vision of an angel in hell. His skin, once perfectly wrought, was now spattered with gore, pierced through in 100 different places. His crown of golden hair was sodden with blood, leaking from a crown of wounds. In his hand, he held a golden sword, the blade shimmering with incandescent power. Red tears filled the angel's eyes and ran down his face, dripping from his chin. In a moment that stretched forever, he looked into Tyrion's eyes. Tyrion felt the fire of the angel's gaze pour into him. The chorus in his own blood cried out, and in that split second of eternity, he knew what he had to do. Farnham had his weapon raised, his good eye narrowing as he took aim at the angel. Tyrion squeezed his trigger first, the sharp crack of his las rifle deafening in the confined space. Farnham's head exploded like an overripe fruit, the remains of his skull spraying wetly against the wall. Tyrion was already pivoting, holding down the trigger as he faced Vars. Vars was quick, always had been, but it wasn't enough to save him. Tyrion's fire caught his shoulder, his chest and his thigh as he tried to dive for cover. Before he could say anything, Tyrion fired twice more into his torso, and he went still. Tyrion had barely looked away, but when he turned, the angel was upon him. He'd heard no sound, and he'd seen no movement out of the corner of his eye. The huge figure was just there, staring down at Tyrion with his bloody martyr's eyes. Tyrion's rifle fell from nerveless fingers, and he lifted his numb hands to his chest in the sign of the Aquila, something he once swore he would never do again while he still drew breath. As he looked up into the angel's face, Tyrion realized he was weeping too, blood leaking from the corners of his eyes as his body began to come apart. He had been touched by this creature, and the blood of the angels was never meant to run in mortals' veins.
Ave Imperator,
Tyrion said. The angel reached out its hand and touched Tyrion. He smeared blood from his palm across Tyrion's forehead and wrapped his hand around the back of Tyrion's skull. He held Tyrion's eyes, and the two of them shared that moment together, each weeping their own bloody tears. The angel squeezed his hand. For a moment there was blinding pain, and then there was blackness, as the angel made a fist, squeezing Tyrion's head hard enough that high-pressure jets of brain pulp shot from between his fingers. The Astartes raised its blade and turned from the room. There was no joy in its movements, nor exultation in fulfilling its purpose. The Astartes' face was an empty mask but for the eyes. They burned hot, and they were filled with wrath and madness. Aston Furon was gone. All that remained was a creature who felt no pity, nor remorse, nor pain. He had become an angel of death and vengeance who knew no fear. The angel stepped over the bodies of the dead and walked into the chaos of the ship that was falling apart all around it. It had reclaimed its blade, and thirst needed to be slaked.